I'm Pablo Arboleda from Spain. I'm an architect with an interdisciplinary background including heritage and urban studies, and my field of expertise is modern drawings. Since April, I'm a USF postdoc at the School of Geographical and Earth Sciences here at the University of Glasgow. In my current project, I study what happens when abandoned sites are transformed into new cultural assets, and today I'll focus on one of the 4 different cities that I'm investigating, Madrid. You may have noticed that the title of my presentation has slightly changed from the one that was circulated. Some weeks ago, I called my presentation something like Ruins versus Neoliberalism, while now I opted for negotiating counterpreservation, modern urban drawings, and the recognition of alternative heritage characteristics. I did this change because rather than establishing strict divisions, I consider more relevant to focus on processes of mutual understanding. So this is a view of the building known as Tabacalera, which is a former tobacco factory in Madrid that closed in the year 2000. In 2010, the Ministry of Culture accepted to lease for free part of this space to a so-called self-managed social center. So this is CSA in its Spanish acronym, and this leasing is renovated every 2 years. In less than a decade, the CSA, and by extension the Tabacalera building, has become an icon of communal practices and alternative cultural expressions. However, last spring, the ministry announced that the building will face an integral restoration to host new and formal cultural uses. This does not mean that the CSA will be kicked out, but the restoration project has opened a debate on whether a whitewashed space would still retain the spirit of such an experimental initiative. This is the story of a negotiation process which is still awaiting for its happy ending. So this presentation is divided into 4 different blocks. First, I'll reflect deeper from Tabacalera's industrial past to its recent history as a CSA and the ministry's plans. Second, I'll define my research approach, including Daniela Sandler's counterpreservation and the heritage gap that I'm exploring in her theory. Third, I justify the strong relation between a building that visually functions as a ruin and the alternative uses that are carried out inside. And last, a brief conclusion highlighting the necessary circumstances that have to take place for an eventual successful outcome. So, Tabacalera is a 30,000 square meter building erected at the end of the 18th century, and architecturally speaking, its actual form responds to a solid military design. In 1977, the building was enlisted with the highest degree of heritage protection in Spain, and this recognition is very traditional, focusing on a great industrial narrative and the outstanding architectural qualities of this space, while the history of workers and what has happened in the last 40 years is omitted. Within this, the role and former presence of cigarreras or female cigarette makers is particularly important, with thousands of them producing millions and millions of cigarettes for decades and representing values such as feminism, class struggle, citizens' rights, and networks of care. Tabacalera functioned as a state-run tobacco factory for 2 centuries, and after the privatization of the company, the building closed in the year 2000 and the property passed to the Ministry of Culture. Tabacalera's history after abandonment is strongly related to the circumstances surrounding the 2008 economic crisis, which particularly hit Spain. In the pre-crisis context of the early 2000s, when public mega projects were still one of the main economic engines in the country, a 30 million euros restoration of Tabacalera was planned to host the National Center for Visual Arts, an initiative that was ultimately dismissed due to the lack of funds. The Indignados movement emerged, demanding radical democracy and self-managed spaces to materialize their claims. As mentioned, in the year 2010, the Ministry of Culture leased part of Tabacalera to the creation of the CSA, because in the eyes of the authorities, there was nothing better to do with this building. The recent plans to restore the building respond to a post-crisis scenario where new economic growth makes possible to rethink the site. In sum, the CSA in Tabacalera must be understood within the implications that the pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis scenarios are having in the public space. Tabacalera is located in Lavapiés, a neighborhood that used to be peripheral in Madrid, though progressively with the city's growth it became quite central. Tabacalera has traditionally been a vivid working-class neighborhood facing the stigma of poverty and insecurity. And in the early 2000s, this stigmatization increased due to the arrival of immigrants, but at the same time, Lavapiés emerged as a place of diversity, integration, and left-wing initiatives. Just recently, the British magazine Time Out declared Lavapiés as the coolest neighborhood in the world, while simultaneously Lavapiés is facing renovations, evictions, tourism, hotels, the Airbnb effect, etc., that are transforming the soul of the neighborhood. Yet the CSA in Tabacalera is a micro-universe that mirrors all these problematics. Whatever happens in Lavapiés is reflected in the building, including the tension of being a cool space. The contradiction or paradox between being a gentrification actor when the project is self-defined as just the opposite is undoubtedly present. So how is the building organized? First, I must say that Tabacalera, the building, actually hosts two different uses. Part of the ground floor is a formal exhibition gallery for contemporary art run by the Ministry of Culture. On the other hand, considerable parts of the ground floor and the semi-basement belong to the CSA. Within this, the CSA functions as a radical public space with 30 different collectives focusing on theater, dancing, painting, arts and crafts, psychology, reggae culture, film projections, photography workshops, etc. Each of these different uses has a specific room, and they all share the most characteristic common spaces within the building, which is the central nave and the backyard. The goal is free culture, mutual learning, and everyday life, and following certain norms, there are opening times, assemblies, events, parties, etc. One can easily become part of any of these collectives or suggesting and proposing a new one. Moreover, the CCA's facilities are open to the public from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. every day except for Mondays. Apart from this, there are a first and a second floor which today are completely empty, and certainly the building is under use, and this explains the ministry's aim to accommodate new activities under the project known as Tabacalera 2020. The truth is that a couple of decades ago, a tourist in Madrid would not have many spaces to visit. But in the last 20 years, the city has been developing the so-called art promenade, a 3-kilometer walk with 25 different cultural attractions, some of them as important as the Prado Museum, the Reina Sofia Museum, the Thyssen Museum, and all this has reimagined Madrid as a tourist destination. Tabacalera 2020 is an attempt to accomplish this promenade by filling Tabacalera with great art collections such as the Cisneros Foundation or an expansion of the Reina Sofia Museum. Beyond the costly restoration of the building, the CSA is opposed to this project for 4 different reasons. First, it deepens the current musealization and cultural gentrification of the neighborhood, while other necessities remain unattended. Second, the presence of expensive artworks will inevitably convey the extreme securitization of this space, something which is contrary to the libertarian spirit of the CSA. Third, though the CSA would still remain in the building, the construction works would imply a temporary break in their activities, and there's a fear that such a break could become definitive. And fourth, the notion of integral restoration and architectural mega-project jeopardizes current realities within the CSA, like self-construction, sustainability, humbleness, and the communal culture. Yet Tabacalera 2020, as it is conceived now, would endanger the tangible and intangible heritage values acquired by the CSA in the recent years. In sum, the resistance expressed by the CSA is not only critical but proactive. They admit that the building has the capacity to host new uses as long as these are public key priorities for the neighborhood and respectful with the aesthetic and social soul of the building. This is the context where the negotiation is in this moment, to which I expect to contribute through counterpreservation. Counterpreservation is a term coined by architectural historian Daniela Sandler in her book Counterpreservation: Architectural Decay in Berlin since 1989. It was published a couple of years ago. Just like you can see in this picture of the iconic Haus Schwarzenberg located in Berlin city center, Sandler defines counterpreservation as the purposeful embracing of architectural decay, a practice that should not be mistaken with neglect or destruction. In the context of Berlin, counterpreservation has a social dimension which is well documented and related to the squatting culture, guerrilla urbanism, and participative projects that somehow strengthen the city's countercultural image facing gentrification. Knowing this, Sandler opts for focusing on the aesthetic dimension, where counterpreservation is not only an intentional practice, but somehow becomes a style consolidated through minimal architectural repairs and new additions, a style that respects the ruined materiality of buildings while allowing them to change, a style that has no final form, and thus its fixed state is that of constant transformation. Deploying Sandler's theory, and back to the case of Tabacalera, my goal is to connect these social and aesthetic dimensions within this approach through a heritage framework. Here, the rich, complex, and alternative lifestyle suggested by the CSA becomes a sort of intangible heritage that only makes sense as long as the ruined materiality of the building is also considered as a tangible heritage. Counterpreservation is then an important point of departure because it stands in between freezing a ruined site in time and letting it go. Counterpreservation comes to fill the gap between arrested decay and curated decay as the two main edges to deal with contemporary ruins. Counterpreservation has been there for some decades, that's true, but without a doubt, Sandler's greatest contribution lays in giving it a name. Now the time has come to perceive counterpreservation as a valid and alternative heritage conservation approach, susceptible to be a negotiating tool. So the question is, how to incorporate counterpreservation within the institutional imagery without losing its alternative character? How to embed counterpreservation in the system without being engulfed by the system? If the CSA in Tabacalera is threatened by a classical idea of heritage restoration, the answer is not to turn our head from heritage. Indeed, heritage is needed, but it is also true that we need a more critical conception of heritage, one that involves social activism and decay as a choice, a perspective that also rejects top-down approaches. And while negotiations are still carried out and the future is still uncertain, the object of my work is to provide a series of solid reflecting thoughts on the role of the CSA in Tabacalera as a contemporary heritage reality. Thus, the potential research impact of my work is to serve as a convincing tool to foster a debate with those authorities that have not yet contemplated counterpreservation as an option. And how do I expect to do this? What am I doing? From May to July, I identified and initiated contacts with the CSA's activists that are leading this negotiation process. In September, I integrated into one of the collectives within the CSA, a collective that is formed by contemporary archaeologists whose main concern is the conservation of the building. And progressively, I gained their trust, and today I'm part of the roundtables and discussions regarding the future of the building. Yet this is not participant observation, this is rather participatory action research with hopefully an impact in real life. I'm about to conclude this immersive ethnography, and I'll have to conduct the last interviews in the next few weeks. So now I will account the most interesting aspects that I'm encountering in my ongoing investigation, and the first of them is a very recurring thought in the conversations I'm having. The notion that after Tabacalera 2020, the CSA must keep being a space of resistance. But the term resistance seems to be narrowly confrontational here. Practitioners in the CSA are not radical, anti-system people organizing themselves for a political revolution. Practitioners here are a retired woman who wants to learn how to paint a watercolor, a music band of young people who cannot afford a place to rehearse, a couple who attend salsa lessons, or a Senegalese immigrant who found a site to project his latest film. Everything for free in the middle of the neoliberal city. Now, is there anything more revolutionary than that? I realize that this communal, everyday life is a particular understanding of resistance, a set of meaningful urban practices that, beyond the usual recognition of food, traditional folklore, music, dances, etc., become the contemporary, intangible heritage for these people. Therefore, there's a huge sense of belonging which is consolidated through the people's production of space. When they got into Tabacalera 8 years ago, collectives organized themselves to clean, to repair, to decorate, and they opted for refusing the money that the ministry was offering to fund their self-building activities because they wanted to safeguard their autonomy. Until today, The maintenance and constant evolution of the building is the entire responsibility of the CSA, and this represents another communal experience to live. The CSA has not only become a new icon of the city, a magnet for those people who want to do things differently. The CSA is a place that finds an ally in the passing time, because as time passes, this initiative acquires a greater sense of identification with a seemingly ruined building. In heritage terms, something is more significant when it belongs to you for a longer time. I can tell the great love and fascination that the CSA practitioners feel for Tabacalera in its current state of controlled chaos. And indeed, when I use the term ruin to refer to the building, they always narrow this word down, because ruin has certain negative or pejorative connotations, and after all, as they say, this building is more lifeful than many others. But what it's indisputable is that ruin aesthetics, materialized in broken windows or cracking paint, represent both the industrial authenticity of the original building and the adequate scenario for experimental activities that it is today. By embracing decay, Tabacalera is a unique spot within a city full of conventional and neat cultural centers. And here, it's worth to mention that singularity is one of the key conditions to perceive something as heritage. Ruin aesthetics and the CSA's identity form a single unity, and this connection must be taken into account for the project's continuity. The last, but certainly not the least remarkable aspect that I found in my heritage reading of Tabacalera is that of memory interpretation. I realized that people in the CSA are not entirely familiar with the spatial history of the building, and for sure, if you go there, they won't give you an information booklet at the entrance. Far from being a problem, this exemplifies that while history is embedded in the respective material culture of the building, original doors, furniture, etc., history is not a burden and remains open to one's own desires for exploration and discovery. Cigarretta's history of struggle is not directly decoded, but rather it's implicit in the CSA's libertarian character. Yet the CSA is a site of memory, but not by staging, but by behaving. Therefore, the main concern is the here and now, where the role that the CSA plays has already become a new layer of history, which is as important as the industrial past. The CSA in Tabacalera is certainly not a perfect place, and indeed many people with whom I've spoken, they express a sort of love and hate relation with the building due to the inherent frictions within communal life and the existing challenge to integrate wider social sectors. But what is a perfect place after all? In order to recognize its heritage values without endangering them, we need mutual understanding between stakeholders, sensibility and daring amongst experts, the assumption that Tabacalera will inevitably host new uses, and the respect for the existing autonomy within the CSA. This is, as far as I explored, the recipe for a successful negotiation, and if these tips were not considered, well, the CSA's practitioners will not hesitate in taking their struggle to the streets. But that would be a different story. And now, this is normally the moment in which I would say, thanks for your attention, presentation is over, but let me say that the next stop in my postdoc will be the Center for Arts and Urbanistics, a former train depot in Berlin that has been transformed into a residence for artists and researchers. I'll be living here for next April to June, and my object will be to investigate the role of cultural entrepreneurs in the reactivations of modern ruins and the surrounding public space, using the place where I'll be living as a case of study. And that, for sure, will be a different story. So now, yes, thanks for your attention.